The paper bag slid across the cracked asphalt and came to rest against the toe of a black boot. It was a small thing, brown paper folded at the top, the kind you get at a bakery or a corner store. It had come off the seat of a motorcycle parked at the edge of the lot, caught by a gust of October wind that didn't care what it touched. The man who owned the boot looked down at it for a long moment before he reached down and picked it up. His name was Holt Decker. He was 68 years old. He stood 6 feet 2 and weighed 260 pounds, most of it still muscle, even after the years had done their work. His beard was white and long kept loose because he had stopped caring about keeping it neat somewhere around the time he stopped caring about a lot of things. His leather vest was covered in patches that most people in Millhaven, Indiana crossed the street to avoid reading too closely. His hands were the size of small shovels and had done things in his life that he did not speak about and tried on most nights not to think about. He stood in the parking lot of Patsy's Diner on a cold Tuesday morning in October and held the paper bag and felt the warmth of whatever was inside it coming through the paper against his palm. He looked around the lot, a pickup truck he recognized belonging to a feed store owner named Garrett. 2 cars he didn't know. The street beyond the lot was empty in the early morning gray, just the stoplight at the corner cycling through its colors for nobody. He looked at the bag again. Then he put it in his saddlebag, got on his bike, and rode home. Millhaven was not the kind of town that appeared on lists. It had a population of about 4,000 people, a single traffic light, a grain elevator visible from every point in town, a diner, a hardware store that had been closed for 2 years, with the same hand-lettered sign still in the window, saying back in 15 minutes in a motorcycle shop at the edge of the main road called Pruitt's that had been there for 30 years and would probably outlast the town itself. Holt lived in a single-room trailer set on cinder blocks behind the shop. He had lived there for 11 years since he and his wife Nadine had come through Millhaven on what was supposed to be a 2-week stop on a longer ride and had never left. Nadine had loved the flatland and the wide sky and the way the light came across the fields in the evening. She had said it felt like a place that was honest about what it was. She had been right about most things. She had been gone for 3 years now. Pancreatic cancer, which was the kind that didn't negotiate and didn't give you time to argue with it. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Holt had been with her every one of those 56 days and had held her hand when she stopped breathing and had sat with her for a long time after in the quiet room. Not because he believed she was still there, but because he could not make himself stand up and walk out and begin the life that came after. The life that came after had not been much of a life. Rex Pruitt was 61 years old and had owned the shop for as long as anyone could remember. He was a lean, quiet man with grease permanently embedded in the lines of his knuckles, and a face that had been weathered down to something essential like wood left outside for decades, until all the softness was gone and only the grain remained. He and Holt had ridden together for 40 years through chapters and runs and stretches of road that crossed the country in every direction. They did not talk much. They had never needed to. Some friendships are built on conversation, and some are built on something older and harder to name, the kind where you know a man well enough to read his silence, and he knows you well enough not to fill it. Rex had given Holt the trailer when Nadine died, had cleared it out and put a new mattress in it, and left a key on the workbench without saying a word about it. Holt had moved in that same week and had been there ever since. The daily shape of his life had become very simple. Simple in the way that things become simple when a person stops asking them to be more than what they are. 5:30 in the morning, he pulled on his boots. He pulled on his vest. He walked his old Harley Softail out from under the corrugated metal awning beside the trailer and started it. The engine turned over with a sound like a large animal clearing its throat low and even and settling into its own rhythm. He let it warm up for 2 minutes. Then he rode the 3 miles into town, the road empty at that hour, the fields on either side of the highway, pale and still in the early light. He parked at Patsy's. He went inside. He sat in the same booth, the one in the back corner, with a view of both the door and the window. An old habit that had nothing to do with paranoia, and everything to do with 40 years of living in ways that made situational awareness a kind of second nature. The waitress was a woman named Loretta, mid-50s, efficient with reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she only ever used to read the specials board and never for anything else. She had worked the early shift at Patsy's for 15 years. She brought Holt his coffee without being asked. Black, no sugar, in a heavy ceramic mug that had been through the dishwasher so many times the pattern on the side had worn down to a ghost of itself. She did not ask if he wanted food. She had tried in the beginning. The first week after Nadine died, she had set a menu in front of him, and he had pushed it aside gently and said, "Just the coffee, thank you." And she had nodded and taken the menu back and had not put one in front of him again. Not once in 3 years. She understood, without his having to explain it, that the coffee was what he came for, and the coffee was what he needed, and anything else would be something he hadn't asked for. He sat. He drank the coffee slowly. He watched the street through the window. He thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest thing to peace he had found in 3 years. When the mug was empty, he set a $5 bill under it, stood, nodded to Loretta, and walked out. He got on his bike. He rode home. That was the life. That was all of it. Coffee, ride, shop, sleep, repeat. Rex let him work on bikes in the afternoons, and Holt was still good with his hands, still knew engines, the way some men know music by feel rather than by instruction. They worked side by side in the afternoons, mostly in silence, and occasionally in the shorthand of men who have spent enough time together that whole conversations can happen in a handful of words. Then Holt ate something from a can in the trailer and went to sleep and got up at 5:30 and did it again. He did not eat breakfast. Food in the period after Nadine died had stopped being food. It had become fuel, something you put in your body because your body required it, the way you put oil in an engine, because the engine requires it, not because the oil means anything. Breakfast in particular had belonged to Nadine. She had been a woman who took breakfast seriously, who made eggs with actual attention and cut fruit into a bowl and put it on the table with a small glass of orange juice, like it was a matter of some importance how the day began. Holt had eaten those breakfasts for 31 years without giving them much thought and had understood what he'd had only after it was gone. So he drank coffee, black, no food, and the days passed. He set the paper bag on Rex's workbench when he got back to the shop that morning. Rex was already in, crouched over a carburetor from a 1978 shovelhead that had come in the week before. He looked at the bag, then he looked at Holt. Then he went back to the carburetor. "Somebody leave that for you," he said. It wasn't really a question. "Looks like it," Holt said. "You eat it." "Not yet." Rex nodded once, which was his way of saying he had heard and understood and had no further comment, and returned his full attention to the carburetor. Holt stood at the workbench and looked at the bag for a long time. He was not a suspicious man by nature, but 40 years in the world he had lived in had given him a hard-earned caution about things that arrived unexpectedly. Gifts that came with no explanation had a way of coming with explanations attached that you found out about later, and the later finding out was usually worse than whatever the gift had been worth. But this was a paper bag with something warm in it left on the seat of his bike, in an empty parking lot in a town of 4,000 people, where the most dangerous thing that had happened in recent memory was a dispute over a property line on the north end of Callaway Street. He sat down on the stool by the bench. He opened the bag. Inside was a biscuit, a hard-boiled egg that had already been peeled, and a paper napkin that had been folded carefully in half, and then in half again, like someone had taken some time with it, like the folding had been deliberate. The biscuit was still faintly warm. Not fresh from the oven, but warm in the way something stays warm when it's been held close to a body. Holt ate the biscuit. He ate the egg. He held the folded napkin in his hand for a moment before setting it down on the bench. It was the first breakfast he had eaten in 3 years. He did not think about what that meant. He finished his coffee from the thermos he kept by the bench, stood up, and went to work on a set of brake calipers that needed cleaning. Rex said nothing, but Holt caught him looking once in the way Rex looked at things he had decided not to comment on. The bag was there again the next morning. Same brown paper bag, same folded top. Same contents, biscuit peeled, egg folded napkin. The biscuit was warm. Holt stood in the Patsy's parking lot for a moment after he found it, looking around the lot, and at the street beyond it, but there was nobody. A delivery truck 2 blocks over. A dog crossing the road alone. Nothing else. He ate the breakfast at the workbench again. Rex watched him do it without appearing to watch him do it, which was one of Rex's particular skills. The third morning, Holt came out of the diner and walked to his bike, slowly watching the lot from the corner of his eye. He stood at the bike and made a show of checking the mirrors and the tire pressure while actually scanning the perimeter of the lot. Nothing moved. He got on the bike and rode home with the bag in his saddlebag. By the end of the first week, it had become a thing he expected. He did not examine that too closely. He just ate the breakfast at the bench and went to work. The second week, he started leaving things. He left a pair of wool socks, thick ones rolled together, placed on the seat of his bike before he went into the diner. He came out and the socks were gone, and the bag was in their place. He left a folded $20 bill held down by a small rock, gone in the morning bag in its place. He left a wool blanket clean folded neatly on the seat, gone, bag in its place. He thought about what this meant for several days before he spoke to Rex about it. When he did, Rex was underneath a Road King working on the exhaust. Holt told him about the socks and the money, and the blanket told it flat, without editorializing the way he told most things. Rex slid out from under the bike. He was quiet for a moment. "You know what she's doing, right?" he said. "She has to be a kid. The way you describe the folding. And the trades. That's a kid." Holt nodded. He'd thought the same thing. Rex wiped his hands on a shop rag. "She's giving you her food," Rex said. "She doesn't have any other food. She's giving you hers." Holt looked at the workbench. He looked at the current bag sitting there, the napkin half unfolded beside it where he'd left it. "And you've been taking it," Rex said. "Not accusing, just stating it." Holt didn't answer that. Rex went back under the bike. Holt sat on the stool for a long time. He started watching in earnest after that. He was at the diner parking lot at 4:30 the next morning, an hour before his usual time, sitting on his bike in the dark at the far end of the lot where the light didn't reach. He sat with the stillness of a man who has learned that patience is not a virtue, but a tool, the kind of stillness that comes from years rather than temperament. 5:15, a shape moved in the shadows near the dumpster on the far side of the lot. Small, moving low and quick, keeping to the edges of the light. It crossed the open space of the lot in about 8 seconds, placed something on the seat of his bike, with 2 hands held carefully, then turned to go. Holt cleared his throat. The shape froze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move from where he was sitting. "Hey," he said. The shape turned slowly. She was small even for a child. Maybe 11 years old, maybe a little less or a little more. It was hard to tell in the gray pre-dawn light. She was wearing a jacket that had been good, once a denim jacket with a flannel lining, but it was torn at one shoulder and the cuffs were frayed down to threads. Her jeans had a tear at the knee. Her shoes were sneakers that had seen too many miles and too much weather. Her face was thin in the way children's faces should not be thin, the kind of thin that comes from not enough of something for long enough that the body starts using itself up. She looked at him. She did not run. She did not speak. "What's your name?" Holt said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head once, very small, and ran. Not panicked, running, not stumbling. Purposeful, quick, already knowing the route she was going to take before she moved. Around the corner of the hardware store and gone. Holt sat on his bike in the quiet lot. After a while, he picked up the bag from the seat. He rode home. She let him see her 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, always at the edges of things. A flash of the torn jacket behind the church on 5th Street. A small shadow moving fast down the alley behind the coin laundry. Once he thought he saw her sitting on the fire escape of the old Beckman building 3 floors up, watching the street below, but when he looked again, there was nothing there. He left things on the bike seat every morning. Every morning they were gone, replaced by the bag. He left a new pair of gloves lined the warmest kind he could find at the hardware store. Gone. He left a hooded sweatshirt in what he guessed was her size. Gone. He left another 20, then a 50. Both gone. He tried leaving a note once written in his large and not particularly elegant handwriting on a piece of shop paper. You don't have to do this. Keep the food. I'm fine. The note was gone in the morning. The bag was there. The bag always came back. Rex watched this without comment for the better part of 2 weeks before he spoke again. He waited until they were both in the shop a slow afternoon, with rain coming down on the corrugated roof and the smell of oil and cold air mixing in the way Holt had always found oddly comforting. She won't take charity, Rex said. He wasn't looking at Holt. He was looking at the engine block in front of him. No, Holt said. She'll trade, but she won't take. Holt said nothing. So you need to find her, Rex said, not to make her stop, but because she doesn't have a place. You can see it in everything she does, the route she takes, the way she moves in the early morning before anyone's up. She knows that lot because she's been sleeping near it. Holt had thought about this. Had thought about it in the small hours of several mornings lying on the cot in the trailer, looking at the ceiling. She doesn't want me to find her, he said. No, Rex said. She doesn't. But what she wants and what she needs aren't the same thing right now. They were quiet for a while. The rain came down harder on the roof. I know, Holt said. He sat with it through the rest of that afternoon and into the evening. He ate his dinner from a can without tasting it, and lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about a child who folded napkins carefully and left breakfast for a man she had never spoken to, because, as it would turn out, she could see that he was sad and she had a biscuit. He had not thought about what he looked like to other people in a long time. He had stopped thinking about himself from the outside somewhere in the months after Nadine died, had retreated to the interior and stayed there doing what needed to be done each day and not much more. The idea that someone had looked at him and seen something worth tending to was a strange idea. Strange and quiet and sitting in his chest like something that had been placed there very carefully. He made up his mind. The next morning the bag was not there. He waited in the lot until 6:30, then 7. The seat of his bike stayed empty. He felt it before he understood what he was feeling, a cold shift in his chest, low and steady, that he recognized from only one other time in his life. He stood next to his bike in the pale morning light and felt it, and knew what it meant, and did not stand there long before he started moving. He walked every alley behind Patsy's and the 3 blocks on either side of it. He checked the dumpster enclosure across the lot. He walked to the church on 5th Street and knocked on the side door until Pastor Wendell Ames opened it in his bathrobe. Looking more alarmed than pastoral, and Holt described the girl, briefly torn jacket, thin, maybe 11, and Ames said he hadn't seen her, and Holt said thank you and left. He went to the Coin Laundry on Grant Street. He went to the convenience store on the highway access road and spoke to the man opening it up for the morning. He went to the bus depot, which was really just a concrete building with 3 plastic chairs and a printed schedule on the wall, and spoke to the woman behind the window who told him she hadn't seen a child alone in at least a week. By 9 in the morning, he had covered the town. He was standing at the intersection of Main and 3rd about to turn back toward the shop when he heard it. Very faint. From the alley behind the old Whitaker hardware building, the one that had been closed for 2 years, with the back in 15 minutes sign in the window. A small sound, like something trying not to make any sound at all. Holt walked into the alley slowly. The alley ran straight back about 40 feet and dead-ended at a chain-link fence with a gap in it that led to the rail yard access road. There was an old loading dock along the right side, concrete steps crumbling at the edges, the overhead door rusted shut. The space under the steps made a low triangle of shadow. She was there, curled small the way an animal curls when it is hurt and hiding and has used up all its energy on both, with nothing left for anything else. She had the blanket he had left for her 3 days ago pulled tight around her shoulders. Her face was turned toward the wall. He could see, even from the entrance of the alley, even in the low light, that something was wrong with her face. He walked toward her, slowly making enough sound on the gravel that she would hear him coming, keeping his hands visible at his sides. She heard him. She turned and flinched hard, pulling back against the wall under the steps. Holt got down on one knee. He was still several feet away. "It's just me," he said. "It's Holt, the man with the bike." I'm not going to hurt you. She was looking at him with one eye. The other eye was swollen shut, puffed up and dark, the skin around it an ugly purple black that spread down across her cheekbone. Her lower lip was split and had bled and dried. There were streaks of dried blood on the front of her jacket. Her feet were bare. Her shoes were gone. Her feet were dirty and cut across the soles. The blanket he'd left was the only thing she had. He stayed on one knee and didn't move. "Who did this?" he said. She tried to answer. It came out in pieces the way speech comes when you've been holding your breath for a long time and your body has forgotten how to let it go normally. Two men. She had been coming across the lot early before anyone was up, and they had been behind the dumpster. They had seen her with the bag. They thought she had money. They took her shoes. They took the food. When she tried to get away, one of them had hit her. She had run as far as she could and ended up here and had been here since. Holt listened to all of it without moving. His hands were shaking, not from cold. He was aware of them shaking, and he was aware of what the shaking meant, and he set it aside, the way you set aside something you'll deal with later, placed it on a shelf at the back of himself and closed the door. "Can you stand?" he said. She tried. She couldn't put weight on one foot, the right one, where a cut across the arch had bled and then dried and stiffened. Holt moved forward slowly and crouched beside her. He held out his hands palm up so she could see them, see the choice being offered rather than a thing being done to her. She looked at his hands for a long moment. Then she reached out and took hold of his forearm with both of hers, and he lifted her, and she weighed almost nothing, like a bag of sticks wrapped in cloth and skin, like something the world had been in the process of using up. He carried her out of the alley. He had ridden his bike to this end of town, and it was parked at the mouth of the alley. He stood beside it with her in his arms and worked out the problem. He couldn't ride with her like this. Her foot needed to be cleaned and wrapped before she could put weight on it, and she needed to be warm, and she needed to eat. He started walking. 3 blocks to Patsy's, the bike rolled alongside him with one hand on the handlebar, the girl in his other arm with her face turned against his shoulder. She had stopped trying not to cry. She was crying quietly now, the way children cry when they have held it for so long it finally breaks open on its own, steady and exhausted and not really about any one thing anymore. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't tell her it was okay. He just walked. Loretta saw him coming through the plate glass window from 20 feet away and had the door open before he reached it. "Lord in heaven," she said. "Bring her in," he said. "Back booth." Loretta moved fast for a woman who had spent 15 years in the measured economy of diner work. She had a clean wet towel on the table before Holt had set the girl down. She had a dry one for the foot. She had the first aid kit from behind the counter open on the seat beside the booth. Holt sat across from the girl and cleaned her face with the wet towel working gently around the swollen eye, the split lip. She watched him with the one eye she could open. She didn't flinch anymore. She was past flinching, at least for the moment. Loretta wrapped the girl's foot while Holt held her still and talked to Loretta quietly about what he needed. "Eggs," he said, "scrambled, pancakes, bacon sausage toast, orange juice, and keep it coming until she tells you to stop." Loretta went to the window and called it back to the cook. The cook, a man named Bertie, who had been at Patsy's longer than Loretta and had seen most things, came out of the kitchen and stood in the opening to the dining room and looked at the girl in the booth and the big man sitting across from her. He stood there for a moment taking it in. Then he went back to the kitchen and put everything on at once. Holt waited until the food came and the girl had started eating before he asked her anything. He watched her eat with the attention of someone who has learned to read a great deal into small things. She ate fast at first, her eyes moving once to the door and once to the window before settling on the plate, the vigilance of someone who had learned that good things could be interrupted. Then as the food kept coming and nobody moved toward her, and the booth stayed warm, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the space around them, she slowed. Her shoulders came down. The hand that wasn't holding the fork uncurled from the edge of the table. He let her eat most of her way through the first plate before he said anything. "What's your name, honey?" She looked up from the plate. "Clara," she said. Her voice was low and a little rough. "Clara what?" Clara May Whitfield. How old are you, Clara? 11. He nodded. He kept his voice even conversational, the tone you use when you wanted answers and didn't want the asking of them to close things down. Where's your mama? Something happened in her face. Not a single thing, but a whole sequence of things moving through quickly, and then the quiet crying started again. She died, Clara said. Last year. She was sick. What kind of sick? Cancer. Holt looked at the table for a moment. Your daddy, he said. She shook her head. My stepdaddy, she said. His name is Stanton. He told me I had to go, said he couldn't feed another mouth. When was that? In the spring. Holt looked up. It was October. He did the calculation without showing it on his face. 6 months. She had been outside and alone for 6 months. He put both hands flat on the table. He kept them there. He breathed in slow through his nose and breathed out slow and kept his face where it needed to be, kept it still because she did not need to see what was behind it right now. You've been giving me your breakfast, haven't you? He said, this whole time. She nodded. Why? She thought about it, really thought about it, the way children think about things when they are not performing the thinking, but actually doing it. Because you look sad, she said, and I had a biscuit. Holt put his hands around the coffee mug in front of him. He held it. He did not trust what would happen to his face if he didn't have something to hold on to. Bertie was still standing in the kitchen opening. Loretta was standing by the counter with her arms folded. Neither of them said a word. Holt looked at Clara across the table. She had gone back to eating. Her one open eye was fixed on the plate with the focused, serious attention of someone doing important work. Clara, he said. She looked up. I know a place that's safe. There's a man there named Rex. He's old and he doesn't talk much, but he's a good man. You'll have a warm place to sleep and food, and nobody is going to hurt you. I'd like to take you there. She looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that belongs to children who have learned to read adults the way you read a road. You're not sure about checking it before you put your weight on it. Then she put her small hand on top of his big, rough one and left it there. Rex was in the shop when Holt pulled up, not on the bike, but on foot. The girl held against his side with one arm because her foot still couldn't take the full weight of walking. Rex came out from under a bike at the sound of the gravel crunching and stood up and looked at them. He didn't ask anything. He went to the back room and cleared off the old army cot and put a clean fitted sheet on it and a wool blanket and a pillow that still had its case on it. He found a sweatshirt on the shelf that was small enough to serve as a shirt on a child. He found a pair of thick socks. He brought them out without comment, set them on the cot, and went back to the bike. Holt set Clara down on the cot. She pulled the sweatshirt on over her torn jacket. She lay down and pulled the blanket up. She was asleep in under 10 minutes. Holt stood in the doorway between the back room and the shop and watched her for a moment. Then he walked out into the shop and sat down on the stool by the bench. Rex kept working. They were quiet for a long time, in the way they were usually quiet, which was comfortably and without pressure, the sound of tools on metal and the occasional shift of weight and nothing else. 6 months, Holt said finally. Rex set down his wrench. 6 months out there, Holt said. Alone. 11 years old. Rex didn't say anything. Her mother died, Holt said. Stepdad put her out. She's been sleeping in alleys and behind dumpsters since spring. Rex looked at his hands on the workbench. And every morning she brought me breakfast, Holt said. Every morning she went without so she could leave something on my bike. The shop was quiet. The wind moved against the corrugated walls. I didn't know, Holt said. And then when I knew, I kept taking it. Rex picked up the wrench again. You stopped, he said. That's the part that matters. Holt sat on the stool for a while longer. Then he stood up and walked outside and sat on the old wooden crate by the trailer door and looked at the sky over the fields going dark in the east. He sat there a long time. At some point in the night, he got up and went into the back of the shop to check on Clara. She was still asleep, the blanket pulled to her chin, her breathing the slow and even breathing of someone who has finally, after a long time without it, found somewhere that feels safe enough to let go. On the workbench beside the cot, she had left something before she fell asleep. A paper bag, small and brown, folded at the top. He opened it. Inside was a biscuit, a hard-boiled egg that had been peeled, and a napkin folded in half, and then in half again, the same careful folds, the same small, deliberate attention. Rex must have given her the egg from the shop refrigerator. She must have found the biscuit somewhere saved. It kept it for the moment she had someone to give it to. Holt stood in the doorway of the back room with the bag in his hands and felt something happen in his chest that he had not expected and could not have prepared for. Not pain, not sorrow. Something older than either of those things. Something that had been sealed off for 3 years and was now quietly and without his permission opening. He sat down on the floor with his back against the doorframe. He ate the biscuit. He ate the egg. He held the folded napkin in one hand and he put his other hand over his face and he cried. Not loudly, not the way grief sounds when it's performing itself. The quiet kind, the real kind. The kind that comes when something that has been stone hard inside you for a long time finally softens just enough to move. He cried for the second time since Nadine's funeral. When he was done, he sat for a while longer in the doorway, listening to Clara breathe in the quiet shop, and looked at the folded napkin in his hand. A small girl with nothing left to give had given it to him anyway. Every morning for 2 months, she had gone without so that he wouldn't have to. She had looked at a big broken man in a leather vest sitting alone over a coffee mug, and she had seen something worth feeding. And she had acted on what she saw without asking anything in return, without expecting anything, with nothing in the transaction except the plain, simple human fact of it. Holt looked at the napkin for a long time. Then he got up off the floor, set the napkin carefully on the workbench, and walked through the dark shop to the back of the trailer. He sat on the edge of the cot. He looked at the old metal trunk at the foot of it. He had not opened it in 3 years. Not since the funeral. Not since the day he had put away the things that had belonged to the man he used to be, because that man had felt like a stranger to him in the months after Nadine died, like someone he had known a long time ago, whose face he could remember, but whose life no longer felt like his. He did not open the trunk tonight, but he looked at it for a long time. Outside, the sky over Millhaven had gone fully dark. The stars were out over the flat fields, more stars than you could see from any city, the whole turning spread of them, cold and clear and indifferent and beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they don't care whether you're watching. Holt sat on the edge of the cot in the dark. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something close to the thing that comes before a decision. Not the decision itself, just the feeling that one was coming, that something was being asked of him by the way things had arranged themselves, by the sleeping child in the next room, and the folded napkin on the workbench, and the 3 years of empty mornings that had somehow, without his planning or choosing it, led here. He didn't know yet what he was going to do. He only knew that he was going to do something, and that whatever it was going to matter. The patrol car came at 7 the next morning. Holt was outside with his coffee, standing in the gravel lot between the trailer and the shop, watching the sky go from gray to pale gold over the fields to the east. It was the kind of morning that looked clean and cold and honest, the kind that made the flat Midwest landscape seem like it was enough, like it had always been enough, if you were the kind of person who could be still long enough to see it. He heard the engine before he saw the car. The particular sound of a Crown Victoria with a government-maintained engine, steady and unhurried, coming up the county road. He tracked it through the bare trees at the edge of the property before it turned into the lot and rolled to a stop on the gravel. 2 deputies got out. Holt recognized the first one immediately. Deputy Hank Dooley, 50 years old, heavy-set in the way of a man who had once been athletic and had let that go gradually over 2 decades without much regret. He had a broad, plain face that was difficult to read at a distance and very readable up close. Holt had known him for 20 years, since Dooley had been a young deputy who'd had occasion to knock on Rex's shop door about a noise complaint and had dealt with the situation with a directness and lack of drama that Holt had respected. They had maintained a careful mutual regard ever since, the kind that existed between men on opposite sides of a clear line, who understood each other well enough to be useful to one another occasionally, and adversarial as seldom as possible. The second deputy was younger, maybe 26, with his hand resting on his belt, in the way that young deputies did when they were not sure what they were walking into and had decided to signal readiness as a precaution. Holt set his coffee mug down on the crate. "Help you," he said. Dooley walked toward him at an even pace. He had the careful, unhurried walk of a man who had learned not to approach large men in leather vests with any energy that could be read as aggression. "Morning, Holt," he said. "We got a call, anonymous, said there was a child being kept here." Holt looked at him. "She's asleep," he said. "We're going to need to see her." "She got hurt yesterday," Holt said. "Two men in the alley behind Whitaker Hardware. Beat her up, took her shoes. I found her and brought her here." Dooley nodded slowly. "That may be, but we still need to see her. You understand that?" Holt understood it. He understood it the way you understand a wall is a wall. You can see it. You can put your hand on it. You cannot wish it into being something you can walk through. He stepped aside. Dooley went to the back room. Holt stayed in the doorway of the shop. The young deputy stayed outside. He heard Dooley's voice through the wall, low and even, no urgency in it. Heard the pause where Clara would be waking up, the brief disorientation of that, the quick animal alertness of someone who has learned to come awake ready. Heard Dooley again explaining things carefully. Heard nothing from Clara for a while and then heard her say something he couldn't make out. Then Dooley came back to the doorway. "I have to take her," he said. "You know that." Holt said nothing. "There's a group home in Carver County runs clean," Dooley said. "I've seen it. It's not a bad place. They'll get a doctor to look at her face and her foot. She'll be safe tonight." Holt looked past him at the back room. "She has nobody," he said. "Her mother is dead. Her stepfather put her out. She's been on the street since spring." Dooley's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. Something moved through his eyes that was not professional. "I hear you," he said. "That changes what we do next, not what we do right now." They were quiet for a moment. "Does she know?" Holt said. "I told her," Dooley said. "She asked about you." Holt walked past Dooley into the back room. Clara was sitting on the edge of the cot, the blanket around her shoulders, her bare feet on the concrete floor. Her eye was still swollen, nearly shut. Her lip was split and dark. She looked very small in the gray morning light coming through the single high window. She looked at Holt when he came in. He crouched down so his face was closer to level with hers. He kept his voice even and quiet, the way he kept it when he was saying things that mattered and didn't want the saying of them to be harder than it had to be. "They're going to take you somewhere warm," he said. "Clean. A doctor is going to look at your eye and your foot. You'll be safe." She looked at him steadily with the one eye that was working. "Are you going to come?" she said. "I can't go with you right now," he said, "but I'm going to find out what happens next, and I'm going to do something about it. You understand me?" She thought about that. Then she nodded once. She stood up. She was still in the sweatshirt Rex had given her, which came down past her hips. She had no shoes. Dooley had found the socks Rex had left, and she had them on. She walked out of the back room with a slight hitch in her right step, where the cut foot was still tender, not limping exactly, more like acknowledging the pain and walking anyway. She held Holt's hand across the shop floor and through the main door and across the gravel lot toward the patrol car. Her hand was small enough that his fingers wrapped entirely around it with room left over. She held on with a grip that was stronger than he expected, the grip of someone who had learned to hold on when holding on was all there was. At the car door, Dooley opened it and stood back. Clara stopped. She turned and looked up at Holt. He kept his hands where she could see them and said nothing. She kept looking at him, that steady reading look, checking the road before she put her weight on it. Then she reached up with her free hand and touched the front of his vest, the worn leather over his chest, just for a second. Then she let go of his hand and got in the car, and the door closed. Holt stood in the gravel lot and watched the patrol car pull out and turn onto the county road and get smaller and disappear. Rex was in the shop doorway. Neither of them said anything. Holt walked back inside. The back room was empty in the particular way that rooms become empty when someone who was in them is gone. The blanket was folded at the foot of the cot, folded carefully, the corners even the same care that went into the folding of napkins. On the workbench beside the cot was the paper bag from last night, the one with the biscuit and the egg, the one he hadn't finished. The napkin was still folded on the bench beside it. He picked it up and put it in his shirt pocket. He walked through the shop and past Rex without speaking and into the trailer and to the metal trunk at the foot of the cot. He stood over it. Then he sat down on the edge of the cot and looked at it for a long time. The way you look at a door, you know you have to walk through and have been finding reasons not to. He reached down and unlatched the clasps. The trunk opened. Inside on top, folded the way Nadine had always folded things with the corners meeting exactly, and the seams aligned, was his vest. Not the everyday vest he wore, the worn one, with the basic patches, the one he'd had on for 3 years. This one, the one underneath, full colors, Hell's Angels, the patches of 40 years of writing of chapters and roads and men and decisions that had cost things worth paying for, and some that hadn't been worth what they cost. The vest he had put away the week of the funeral because he had stood in front of the bathroom mirror the day after she was buried and looked at himself wearing it and had not recognized the man he saw. Had felt like the vest belonged to someone else, someone from before, someone he was not sure he still had the right to be. He picked it up. It was heavier than he remembered, or maybe he was just older. He sat with it in his hands for a while. Then he set it on the cot beside him and reached for the phone on the small table by the wall. The phone was an old one, a flip phone he replaced every few years without upgrading, because the things he needed a phone for did not require anything beyond the basics. He scrolled through their contacts. There were not many. Rex, a parts supplier in Columbus, a few others, and near the bottom of a short list, a name he had not called in 5 years. Wade Thorne, Diesel to everyone who mattered. He had known Wade Thorne for 43 years, since they were both young men riding out of the same chapter in southern Ohio with more certainty than sense and more loyalty than either of them had ever fully articulated. They had ridden across the country together more times than Holt could count, and had been in situations together that had required the specific kind of trust that only exists between men who have stood back to back and held a line. When Nadine died, Diesel had called, had driven 6 hours to the funeral, and stood in the back of the small church and not said anything because there was nothing to say, and he'd known it. They had not spoken in 5 years, since not from any falling out, but from the natural drift of men whose lives had moved in different directions and whose friendship existed in a space that didn't require constant maintenance, because the foundation of it was the kind that didn't erode. Holt called the number. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, older than Holt remembered it, rough at the edges in a new way, the roughness of age rather than the roughness of hard living, though it had some of that too. "Yeah," Diesel Holt said. "It's Holt." A silence on the line. Not the silence of surprise, more the silence of recalibration of a man setting down whatever he was holding and giving his full attention to something new. Holt, Diesel said. "Then you alive, just barely." Another short silence. "Then what do you need?" "There's a girl," Holt said. And he told it. Flat and straight, the way he told everything. No embellishment and no editorializing. Just the sequence of it, from the first paper bag to the alley to this morning, the patrol car pulling away, and the back room empty, and the folded blanket on the cot. He told it in maybe 4 minutes. When he was done, the line was quiet for a long moment. Diesel said, "How old is she?" 11. "And she's been feeding you her breakfast for 2 months." "Yes." Diesel was quiet again. Holt could hear him breathing. Could hear faintly the ambient sound of wherever Diesel was, what sounded like a shop, an air compressor running in the background, the familiar percussion of that. "Where are you?" Diesel said. "Millhaven," Holt said. "Indiana. County seat is Carver. Hearing will probably be set for next week." There's a stepfather. Stanton Keel, Holt said. He put her out in April. Now he wants her back. Diesel said nothing for a moment. Then he said, there's a reason. Has to be, Holt said. We'll find it. Diesel's voice had changed. Not louder, just different in its quality, the way a thing changes when it stops being a conversation and becomes a direction. Don't move, he said. I'm calling everyone. The line went dead. Holt sat on the edge of the cot with the phone in his hand. He looked at the vest beside him. He picked it up and put it on over his flannel shirt. It fit the way it had always fit, which was like something that had been made for him, because in a sense it had been made by the accretion of years and choices and the company of men who had understood what he was before he had fully understood it himself. He stood up. He walked out of the trailer and into the shop. Rex was at the bench. He looked at the vest. He said nothing. Then he crossed the shop and stood behind Holt and straightened the collar the same way he had done 100 times on 100 mornings before rides that mattered. That was all. Diesel's first call went out at 9 that morning. By noon, 3 states knew. By the end of the day, the story had crossed every channel that mattered in that world. Phone calls between chapter officers, posts on private forums, word passed at gas stations and diners, and in the fluorescent-lit waiting areas of parts stores from Ohio to Oregon. Not broadcast widely, not put anywhere public, just moved through the network of men and women who had been moving information through it for decades. Person to person, the way information moves when it matters, and the people moving it understand what it means. The story when it traveled was simple. There was an 11-year-old girl in Indiana who had been living on the streets in spring. Her mother was dead. Her stepfather had put her out with nowhere to go. For 2 months, she had brought breakfast every morning to an old brother who was grieving, and alone had given him her food because she could see he needed it, had asked for nothing in return except the small dignity of a trade. She had been beaten and her shoes taken, and she had spent a night curled under a loading dock before she was found. Now the stepfather, who had not seen fit to feed her or shelter her for 6 months, wanted her back. There was going to be a hearing. That was the whole story. No embellishment required. What moved through the network after that was not outrage exactly. It was something older and quieter and more consequential than outrage. It was recognition. The recognition of a thing that was wrong in a specific, uncomplicated way, combined with the understanding of people who had spent their lives operating outside the normal channels, that when the normal channels failed, there were other channels. Bikers as a culture and a community had a complicated relationship with the wider world's perception of them, and most of them had long since stopped caring about correcting that perception. But inside the culture, there were principles that were not negotiable and did not require articulation. You took care of your own. You showed up when showing up mattered. You did not leave people behind who had earned the right to be counted. Clara Mae Whitfield had earned the right. She had earned it by giving everything she had to a man who needed it without being asked and without expectation. That made her theirs. By the second day after Diesel's call, something else was developing. Something Holt did not know about until Rex came into the trailer on that second evening with his phone in his hand and a look on his face that was Rex's equivalent of astonishment, which was a very slight elevation of both eyebrows and a stillness in his expression that was different from his usual stillness. Diesel's people found something Rex said. He set the phone down on the table and Holt read what was on the screen. Stanton Keel, 49 years old, resident of Marion, Indiana. History of misdemeanor charges going back 15 years. Nothing that had ever landed him in prison, the accumulation of a man who pushed at edges without quite crossing them. 3 separate judgments for debt in Marion County over the past 4 years. A foreclosure proceeding that had been stayed twice and then dismissed under circumstances that were not explained in the public record. And most recently, a filing in circuit court in Marion County that was technically a civil matter related to the management of a minor's estate. Not the custody filing, a separate filing. Filed 3 weeks ago. Holt read it twice. The insurance policy had been taken out by Clara's mother, Eileen Whitfield, 8 years ago. $280,000 with Clara named as sole beneficiary. The policy had a provision that specified the funds were to be held in a supervised account until the beneficiary's 18th birthday unless a court-appointed guardian filed for early release on the basis of demonstrated need. Clara was 11 years old and had 7 years before the money was hers outright, but a legal guardian could petition for early access. Stanton Keel had not known about the policy for most of the time Clara had been on the street. The policy was administered through a firm in Indianapolis that had spent 18 months locating him as the stepfather and legal guardian after Eileen's death, a process delayed by Keel's habit of moving between addresses without forwarding information. The firm had finally reached him 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks after that, Clara's food and the worn sneakers she'd been sleeping in since spring had stopped appearing on the seat of Holt's bike because she'd been found in an alley with a swollen eye. Holt set Rex's phone down on the table. He sat with it for a long while. $280,000, he said. Rex said nothing. She's been living in alleys for 6 months, Holt said. And when he found out about the money, he filed in court inside 2 weeks. Rex looked at the wall the way he sometimes looked at walls when he was working out what needed to be said and hadn't found it yet. She gave away her food because you look sad, Rex said. And this is what she goes back to. Holt stood up. He walked to the workbench and leaned against it with both hands and looked at the floor. Not if I can help it, he said. Rex said, what do you need? Holt thought about it. Diesel has lawyers. He said he had lawyers. He does. 2 chapters over. There's a firm been doing work for the club for 20 years. Pro bono for situations like this. Holt nodded. The hearing. When is it? Rex checked his phone. Just confirmed. Tuesday morning. Carver County Courthouse. It was Friday. Holt looked at the vest hanging on the hook by the trailer door. Get me to Diesel, he said. Tonight. That same evening, without Holt's knowledge, Rex did something that he told no one about until much later. He went to the back of the shop to the room where Clara had slept, and he stood there for a while looking at the army cot and the folded blanket and the indentation in the pillow. Then he went to the far end of the shop to the storage area he had been using for overflow parts and miscellaneous equipment for 15 years, and he started moving things. He worked alone for 3 hours. He carried boxes to the main shop floor. He moved a rolling tool chest that had not been rolled in a decade. He swept the concrete floor. He found in the storage area behind the main shop a second cot that had been there since before he could remember the reason for it. He set it up next to the first. He found a small chest of drawers at the back of the storage area and wiped it down and moved it against the wall. He found a lamp. He found an extension cord. He found a small electric space heater, tested it, found it worked. He went to his own truck and got the small cooler from behind the seat, the one he brought lunch in, and brought it inside and plugged it in against the wall. He found a shelf and mounted it above the chest of drawers with 4 screws and a drill. He found a clean towel and a bar of soap still in its wrapper. He stood back and looked at what he had made. It was a room. Small, not particularly comfortable by any standard that involved carpeting or drywall or windows. But it was a room. It had a door. It had a lock on the door that worked. It had 2 beds and a source of heat and a place to put things and a light to see by. Rex was not a man who explained his reasoning in advance or sought approval for decisions he had already made. He had decided that if Clara came back, or when Clara came back, or if some other child came through the door of his shop needing what Clara had needed, the room would be there. He went back to the shop floor and cleaned up after himself and went home. He did not mention it to Holt. Diesel had been busy. Holt found out the scope of it when he called Diesel again on Saturday morning, the day after reading about the insurance policy, and Diesel walked him through what had been assembled in the previous 36 hours. 3 lawyers from a firm in Cincinnati that had been doing work for the Ohio chapter for 22 years. All 3 had cleared their calendars for Tuesday. They had filed an emergency motion in Carver County Circuit Court Friday afternoon, requesting expedited review of the custody matter on the grounds that the child had been abandoned for 6 months by the filing party, that there was a surviving blood relative willing and able to serve as guardian, and that returning the child to the care of the filing party represented a demonstrable risk. The surviving blood relative was the piece that Holt had not known about. Diesel's people had found her inside 48 hours of the first call. Dorothy Whitfield, 64 years old, Knoxville, Tennessee. Clara's paternal grandmother, the mother of Clara's biological father, who had died in a construction accident when Clara was 3 years old before Eileen had married Stanton Keel, and long before any of what had followed. Dorothy had not known Clara existed. The way Diesel explained it, Keel had been systematically managing Eileen's isolation from her first husband's family from the beginning of their marriage, the way certain people manage the people they are attached to, cutting threads one at a time until there is nothing left that doesn't run through them. By the time Eileen got sick, Dorothy Whitfield had not spoken to her son's widow in 6 years and had no knowledge of the granddaughter she had left behind. The investigator Diesel used had found Dorothy through 3 phone calls and a public records search that took less than a day. When she was called and told what had happened, there was a silence on the line. Then she said, "Tell me what I need to do." She was booked on a flight from Knoxville to Indianapolis for Sunday evening. A driver Diesel arranged was meeting her at the airport and bringing her to a motel in Carver that the club was paying for. She was going to be in that courthouse on Tuesday morning. Holt sat with his phone after he hung up and listened to the wind against the trailer walls. He thought about a woman in Knoxville who had not known she had a granddaughter, who had been separated from her by the deliberate work of a man who had done the same thing to an 11-year-old girl who had been reaching across the same absence from the other end of it. He thought about Clara in the group home in Carver County that Dooley had said was clean and not a bad place, sleeping under whatever blanket they had. They're probably not folding it when she woke up, but maybe folding it, probably wondering what was going to happen next. He thought about Stanton Keel. He thought about Keel for a while and the careful way that he thought about certain things with the long practice of a man who had learned over many years that what you did with what was in your mind was as important as what was there. He let it be there. He looked at it. He did not act on it. He had learned across a long and not always peaceful life that there was a category of person who understood only one kind of response, and that satisfying as that response might be in the moment, it was not always the response that served the people you were trying to serve. What Clara needed was not for Keel to be afraid of Holt Decker. What Clara needed was to be safe permanently and legally in a way that a man's fear of another man could not provide. Diesel understood this too. It was one of the reasons he had been running a chapter for 20 years without it burning down. The lawyers were the right answer. Dorothy was the right answer. The money and trust and the legal record and the judge's order were the right answer. Holt knew this. He still thought about Keel for a while. By Sunday evening, the field outside the Millhaven town limits had its first bikes in it. Holt didn't see them until he rode out to the county road late that afternoon. Just the restlessness of a man waiting for something he cannot accelerate, and saw the shapes of motorcycles parked in the harvested cornfield beyond the town's eastern edge, 3 of them riders standing beside them in conversation. He pulled over and sat on his bike and looked at them. One of the riders saw him and lifted a hand. Holt lifted a hand back. He sat there for a while. Then he rode back to the shop. By Monday morning, there were 40 bikes in that field. By Monday afternoon, there were 300. Rex drove out to look at them at noon and came back and stood in the shop doorway and said to no one in particular that Diesel had been busy. They came from Ohio and from Illinois and from Missouri, from further states as the day went on, from Kentucky and from Tennessee and from further west, chapter riders and independent riders and men who had not been affiliated with any club in years, but who had heard the story through the right people and had gotten on their bikes anyway. They parked in the field with a kind of order that had not been organized in advance, bikes lined up with the natural precision of people who understood the value of not taking more space than you needed and leaving room for the people coming behind you. A man from the Ohio chapter came to the shop on Monday evening, introduced himself to Holt as the point of contact for logistics, said they had arranged with the county for a managed gathering, that the sheriff had been briefed, and had said his preference was for this to be quiet, and he'd been told it would be, and it would. Food was being organized. Medical support in case anyone needed it on the road. Communication between the field and the courthouse was handled. When the man left, Holt sat on the stool by the bench. Rex sat on the other stool. They were quiet for a while. "How many?" Holt said. Rex had been tracking the updates on his phone through the day. "Last count from an hour ago," Rex said. 1,400. Holt looked at the floor. "By morning," Rex said. "More." Holt put his hands on his knees and looked at the workbench and the paper bag still sitting there from Friday, the one Clara had left the napkin still folded beside it. He picked up the napkin. He held it for a moment. He put it in his shirt pocket. He stood up. He went to the trailer and lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling. He did not sleep for most of that night, but it was not the sleeplessness of worry or dread. It was the sleeplessness of a man who has been still for a long time and feels in the hours before something that matters, something he had almost forgotten, the specific weight of being needed, of having somewhere to be, of a morning that was not the same as the one before it. He thought about Nadine. He thought about her the way he had been unable to think about her for most of 3 years. Not the way she looked at the end, but the way she looked on a morning when the light was good, when she was sitting across a table from him in some diner somewhere on a long road, her hands around a coffee cup, her eyes doing the thing they did when she was thinking about something she found genuinely interesting, which was often. She had loved him in a way that had not asked him to be less than he was. That was the thing about her. She had taken the whole of him, the patches and the history, and the men he had been before she knew him, and the things he had done, and had not asked him to apologize for any of it, had simply loved him and expected him to do right by the love. And he had tried across 31 years to be worthy of the standard that implied. He thought she would have known what to do about Clara without thinking about it for very long. He thought she would have had the girl at the kitchen table if they'd had a kitchen table with eggs and toast and orange juice, and would have made it clear without saying it directly, in the way Nadine made most important things clear, that this was where the girl was going to be, and that was the end of the matter. He missed her with a sharpness that was different from the dull, persistent ache of the past 3 years. This was sharper and in a strange way cleaner, like something that had been frozen coming back to itself. He lay there with it for a while. Outside in the field down the road, 1,400 people he had never met were sleeping in the cold next to their bikes because a girl he had known for one morning had brought him breakfast for 2 months. He lay on the cot and felt the weight of that and let himself feel it without pushing it away. In the morning, he was going to put on his vest and get on his bike and ride into town and sit in a courtroom and let 3 lawyers who had driven through the night do what they had come to do. And whatever happened in that courtroom was going to determine where Clara May Whitfield spent the rest of her childhood. He was not going to let her go back to Stanton Keel. He did not know yet, lying on the cot in the dark, exactly how he was going to prevent it. The lawyers had their work. Dorothy was in a motel across town and would be in that courtroom in the morning. The evidence about the insurance policy and Keel's debt was in a file. But Holt had been in enough rooms where things were decided to know that what was in the file was not always what determined the outcome. What sometimes determined the outcome was the weight of a thing. The physical fact of how many people believed it mattered and were willing to say so without saying anything at all. He thought about 2,000 bikes on a highway in October. Then he closed his eyes. He was up at 4:30, not because he had said anything, not because he had slept and woken. He had lain on the cot through most of the night in the particular suspension between sleep and waking that is not restful, but is also not the worst thing. And at 4:30, his body simply decided that lying down was finished and it was time to be vertical. He pulled on his boots. He pulled on his vest. He stood in the small trailer in the dark and looked at himself in the mirror above the sink. The white beard, the lined face, the patches on the leather faded in places, cracked at some of the edges, carrying 40 years of road in the grain of them. He looked at the man in the mirror for a long moment, the way you look at something you are trying to see clearly rather than just see. He did not look away. He made coffee on the small hot plate and drank it standing up, looking out the single window at the dark lot and the dark field beyond it, and the sky that had not yet decided to be anything other than black. Rex knocked on the trailer door at 5. He came in without waiting for an answer, which was his way, and poured himself coffee from the pot and stood against the wall, and they were quiet together for a while. In the dark trailer, drinking their coffee, two old men who had been through enough mornings together that this one, which was different from most, did not require commentary. "You ready?" Rex said finally. Holt said yes. They walked out into the cold together. The sound reached them before the town did. They had ridden the county road 100 times, both of them, in every season and every weather it had to offer, and the road was always quiet at this hour, just the engine sound and the wind and the pale flat fields on both sides going past. But this morning, about a mile out from Mill Haven's eastern edge, Holt heard something underneath the sound of his own engine, a low sound like the sound the earth makes when something large is moving across it, like thunder that had settled in and was not passing through. He rode toward it. The first biker he saw was parked at the edge of the county road where it intersected the gravel farm access road, a single rider standing beside his bike in the pre-dawn dark, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He was wearing a Mongol's cut, and he was maybe 30 years old, and he stood straight when he saw Holt coming and lifted one hand palm out the way you raise a hand to someone you have come a long way to acknowledge. Holt raised one hand back. He kept riding. Around the long curve where the county road bent south before straightening into Millhaven's main street, the world changed. They were on both sides of the road as far as he could see in the early gray light. Shoulder-to-shoulder bikes lined up with the precise informality of people who understood how to fill a space without being told. Hell's Angels and Mongols and outlaws and banditos and riders in cuts he didn't recognize from chapters he'd never crossed, and independent riders in plain leather with no patches at all. Men with white beards like his own, and young men barely past 20, and women in their own colors standing with the same stillness as everyone else. Bikes that had been ridden hard to get here, the dust of 2 days of highway travel still on them, bugs on the windshields, the weariness of distance covered quickly visible in the machines themselves. Every one of them was standing beside their bike. Every one of them had their helmet off. Not one of them made a sound. Holt pulled his bike to a stop at the edge of the corridor they had made and sat there for a moment, his engine idling, looking at what was in front of him. The road ran straight into town, and on both sides of it, for as far as the flat morning light, let him see there were people standing in absolute silence watching him. He could not count them. He stopped trying. Rex pulled up beside him. He heard Rex's engine idle down. He did not look over at Rex. He put the bike in gear. They rode down the middle of the corridor together, the two of them at the pace you ride when you are not in a hurry and do not intend to pretend that you are. On either side, the riders watched them pass. Some of them raised a hand. Some of them nodded. Most of them were simply still, simply present, simply there, which was the whole point and the only point and was enough. Holt did not try to speak. He did not try to acknowledge each person individually. He looked straight ahead and rode, and felt the weight of it moving alongside him, the way the sound of a river moves alongside you when you ride beside it, present and continuous and larger than any single part of it. He had been to funerals with hundreds of riders. He had been to rallies with thousands. He had been in situations in his life where the numbers of people around him had mattered in ways that were immediate and consequential. This was different from all of those. This was 2,000 people who had gotten on their bikes and ridden because a child had brought a man breakfast. That was the whole of it. That was the reason. An 11-year-old girl with nothing had given what she had to someone who needed it. And these 2,000 people had heard about it and had come because that was the kind of thing you came for, because there was nothing more fundamental than that. And when it was threatened, it needed to be answered. Holt rode down the corridor and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not try to name. Diesel was waiting at the courthouse. He was standing at the bottom of the wide concrete steps with his hands in his jacket pockets. A big man Holt's age with a beard that had gone white at the same time Holt's had, and a face that looked like it had been used for most of its years in ways that were not gentle. He watched Holt park and get off his bike and walk toward him, and when Holt was close enough, Diesel held out his hand. Holt took it. They held the handshake for a moment and looked at each other. 43 years of history. In that look, all the roads and the men and the things that had required them both to be more than they would have chosen on easy days. Brother Diesel said, "Then she's coming out in 10 minutes. Social worker is bringing her from the group home. We need to be set." Holt looked at the courthouse steps, then at the street where people had filled in behind the bikes, townspeople who had come out to see what was happening, a few reporters with cameras, 3 television vans across the street with their satellite equipment up. Inside, Diesel said 3 lawyers have been there since 7. The filing is clean. Dorothy is already in the building. She got here an hour ago. The evidence on Keel's death is in the record. Holt nodded. Diesel reached into the inside of his jacket and took out something folded. Before she goes in, he said, "I want to give her this." He held it out. Holt took it and unfolded it. It was a vest, small cut for a child, made from soft brown leather that had been worked until it was supple, not stiff the way new leather is, but broken in, treated the kind of leather that would be warm and not rigid. Someone had done real work on it. The stitching at the edges was hand-done and even. On the back, a single patch rectangular, the kind that went across the shoulders or in the center of a back panel. One word on the patch: family. Holt held it in his hands and looked at it. Diesel said every chapter that came contributed to it. The leather came from a guy in Nevada who's been working hides for 40 years. The stitching was done by a woman in the Ohio chapter who does restoration work. Took them 30 hours over 2 days. Holt folded it carefully. He said she'll understand what it means. Diesel said she will when she's older. Right now, she just needs to know she has it. The county car came around the corner of the courthouse at 7:58. The crowd that had gathered in the parking lot, the bikers who had moved from the road to the courthouse grounds, the townspeople along the edges, the reporters behind their cameras, all of them went quiet as the car came around the corner. The quiet of a large number of people paying attention to the same thing at the same moment. The social worker got out of the driver's side first. She was a woman in her mid-40s with a tired face and practical shoes and the look of someone who had been doing hard work for a long time and had made her peace with most of it. She stood by the car for a moment and looked at the crowd and the bikes and the people standing between her and the courthouse steps, and her expression went through several things in quick succession before settling into something that was open rather than closed. She opened the back door. Clara got out. She was wearing clothes the group home had given her, clean jeans and a plain blue sweater and new sneakers that fit properly. Her hair had been washed and was pulled back. The bruising around her eye had faded from purple-black to a mottled yellow-green, still visible, but no longer swollen shut, both eyes open and working. Her lip had healed to a thin line. She stood beside the car and looked at the crowd. She looked at the bikes first, the rows of them parked along the courthouse grounds and spilling into the street and the parking lots beyond. Then she looked at the people standing between the bikes, the men and women in leather, the patches, the white beards, the quiet faces turned toward her. She went very still, not afraid still. Something else. The still of someone who is trying to take in something that does not fit into any category they have previously assembled. Diesel walked forward. He moved the way he always moved in situations that required care, slowly and with his hands visible and his posture open, giving her every possible signal of non-threat. He stopped in front of her and went down on one knee, bringing his face below the level of hers. "Clara," he said, "my name is Wade. I'm a friend of Holt's." She looked at him. Her eyes moved from his face to his vest and back. "We made something for you," he said. "Can I give it to you?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. He took the small vest from inside his jacket where he tucked it and held it out in both hands unfolded so she could see the whole of it. She reached out and took it. She held it up and looked at the back panel, the single word on the patch. Family. She looked at it for a long moment. Her face was very still and very serious, the face of someone doing important interior work. Then she looked past Diesel at Holt, standing 20 feet back. Holt met her eyes. He nodded once. She put the vest on over the blue sweater. It fit. The shoulders sat right and the front hung even, and she smoothed it with both hands the way you smooth something you want to wear correctly. Then she looked at the crowd again. Diesel stood up. He turned around. He lifted one hand and moved it in a single downward gesture. 2,000 people went to their knees. Not in sequence, not one section at a time, but together, a single movement, as though the same thought had passed through all of them simultaneously, and they had all acted on it at the same moment. The sound of it was a low collective sound, boots and knees on pavement and gravel, and then silence. 2,000 men and women in leather and patches and gray beards and road-worn faces and scars and histories that no one in the wider world would ever fully know, on one knee in a courthouse parking lot in Millhaven, Indiana, for an 11-year-old girl in a borrowed vest who had brought breakfast to a sad man because she had a biscuit. The social worker made a sound and put both hands over her mouth. A reporter behind one of the cameras said something very quietly that was not intended to be captured by the microphone, but was. "Oh my God," he said. Clara did not move for a long moment. She stood in the open space between the car and the steps, and she looked at all of them, all 2,000 of them, on their knees, and her face moved through things that a child's face should not have to move through, and then arrived at something that was not quite any single emotion, but contained several of them at once. Then she walked. Not toward the courthouse steps, not toward the social worker. She walked across the open space toward Holt, and the crowd on either side of her remained still and silent as she passed through them, and she walked until she was in front of him, and then she stopped and looked up at him and lifted both arms. Holt reached down and picked her up. She put her face against his shoulder and her arms around his neck, and he held her with both arms, one hand on her back and one at the back of her head, and he closed his eyes. He did not cry. He had done that already on the floor of the back room with the napkin in his hand, and that had been right for that moment. This moment was different. This moment was not about what had been lost or what had hurt. This moment was about what was here, solid and real, the small weight of her in his arms, and the crowd around them on their knees in the cold morning. He held her. After a while, the crowd began to rise. Not all at once this time, in ones and twos, slowly, the sound of 2,000 people standing up around them like something waking. Diesel walked to the social worker, who had her hand still at her mouth and whose eyes were wet. "Ma'am," he said, "we've got a team of lawyers inside. We've raised some money and we found her grandmother. She's already in the building. We're not here to take this child. We're here to make sure she ends up where she belongs." The courtroom was small, as courtrooms in county seats tend to be, with wood paneling that had been painted over once and should have been again, fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency just below conscious noticing, and 3 rows of gallery seating that had been filled before 8 o'clock. Judge Ellsworth Tate was 61 years old and had been on the Carver County bench for 14 years and had seen most things that a small county bench sees, which is more of human nature than most people encounter, and less of it than city judges see. He had been briefed by his clerk that there was a significant gathering outside and had looked out his office window at 7:45 and had stood there for a while without saying anything before returning to his desk. He came into the courtroom at 8:30 and looked at the people assembled and called the room to order without particular ceremony. Stanton Keel was at the front row of the gallery behind the respondent's table. He was 49 and looked older, with the specific aging of a man whose choices have been catching up with him for some years, a collapsed quality around the jaw and eyes that had nothing to do with the simple passage of time. He was wearing a dress shirt that was not quite the right size and a tie he had knotted unevenly. Beside him was his attorney, a man named Gary Potts, who practiced family law in Marion and whose expression suggested he had not been told about the gathering outside and was currently revising his assessment of the morning. Behind the petitioner's table sat 3 lawyers from the Cincinnati firm, all of them in dark suits and carrying the controlled stillness of people who have done their preparation and are not worried about what happens next. The lead attorney was a woman named Catherine Birch, 52 years old, with short gray hair and reading glasses on the table in front of her, and a case file that was 2 inches thick. Dorothy Whitfield sat in the gallery behind the petitioner's table. She was a compact woman with sharp, dark eyes and white hair cut close, and a posture that suggested she had been told more than once in her life that she did not take up enough space to matter, and had decided a long time ago that this was not information she intended to act on. She had flown in from Knoxville the night before on a ticket the chapter had purchased and had been in this building since 7 in the morning. When Clara came in with the social worker and sat in the chair that had been arranged for her beside Catherine Birch's table, Dorothy turned in her seat and looked at her granddaughter for the first time. Clara looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was no time and the setting was wrong for it. But something passed between them across the 10 feet of courtroom. Something that moved in the way that recognition moves when it arrives not gradually, but all at once, the sudden understanding of a thing you have needed for a long time without knowing what it was called. Dorothy put one hand over her heart. Clara watched her do it. Judge Tate called the proceeding to order. Gary Potts opened for Keel's side, and he did what lawyers do when the facts are not in their favor, which was to redirect attention to what facts there were. He established that Stanton Keel was Clara's legal stepfather of record, that he had provided for Clara during the years of his marriage to her mother, that whatever disruption had occurred in the spring had been the result of temporary financial hardship and emotional difficulty following his wife's death, and that he was now prepared to provide a stable home. He noted that Holt Decker had a criminal record, had been associated with organizations characterized by law enforcement as criminal enterprises, and had no legal relationship to the child. This last part was delivered with a particular kind of emphasis that was intended to land heavily. Holt was sitting in the gallery. He heard it. He kept his face still. Catherine Birch rose when it was her turn. She was not a theatrical lawyer. She did not move around the room or address the gallery. She spoke to the judge in the direct and considered way of someone who trusts the material and does not feel the need to dress it up. She established first the timeline of abandonment. 6 months. Clara had been without shelter, food, or adult protection for 6 months. The social services record from Clara's intake at the group home documented her physical condition, the injuries from the assault, the state of her feet, her weight, the evidence of extended outdoor living. She entered this into the record with the precision of someone who wanted it to be visible and stay visible. She established the circumstances of Stanton Keel's renewed interest in his stepdaughter. She placed into the record the insurance policy documentation, $280,000. The policy administration firm's records of their contact with Keel 6 weeks prior. The timeline contact in September, custody filing in October, Clara's assault and discovery in the same week. And she placed into the record Keel's financial history, the judgments, the foreclosure, the debt schedule, which was substantial and recent. She placed into the record the civil filing Keel had made in Marion County 3 weeks ago, the one regarding the management of a minor's estate, which had been filed before the custody petition and which requested early release of the insurance funds to the legal guardian. She let all of this sit in the room for a moment. Then she said, the petitioner abandoned this child for 6 months. He did not attempt to locate her, did not contact social services, did not file a missing child report. He filed for custody within 2 weeks of learning that she is the beneficiary of a significant insurance policy. He has simultaneously filed in another county for access to those funds. She paused. This is not a custody case, she said. This is a financial transaction. The child is not the subject of this proceeding from the petitioner's perspective. She is the instrument of it. The room was quiet. Judge Tate looked at Gary Potts. Potts had the expression of a man standing in a field watching weather come in from the wrong direction. Catherine Birch then introduced Dorothy Whitfield as a petitioner for guardianship. She entered Dorothy's background, her financial stability, her clean record, her residence and employment history, her status as Clara's blood grandmother, and the documentation of how her separation from the family had been engineered rather than voluntary. She introduced the trust account, $400,000 raised in 72 hours, held by a Cincinnati bank in Clara's name, accessible at 18, or for educational expenses before that administered by 3 co-trustees with no relationship to any party in the proceeding. The trust documents were in the record. She introduced 10 character witnesses, all of them prepared to testify, all of them with clean records and documented employment and addresses in 5 states, all of them prepared to speak to Holt Decker's character and fitness. She did not need to use any of the witnesses. Judge Tate looked at Stanton Keel over the top of his reading glasses for a long moment. He said, "Mr. Keel, I'd like you to explain to me the Marion County filing." Keel looked at Potts. Potts leaned over and said something. Keel looked at the table. He said, "I was just trying to make sure the money was handled right." Judge Tate said, "The money belonging to the child you had not seen or attempted to contact in 6 months." Keel said nothing. The room was very quiet. Judge Tate took off his reading glasses and set them on his bench and looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was the look of a man reviewing what he knows and confirming that it is what he thought it was. He put his glasses back on. He said, "Mr. Potts, I'm going to give your client until noon to withdraw his petition. If he does not withdraw it, I am going to refer the Marion County filing to the circuit court for review as a potential fraud on the court, and I am going to request that social services open an investigation into the 6-month abandonment period. I'll note for the record that the abandonment of a minor in this state carries criminal exposure." Potts leaned over to Keel again. This time the conversation was brief. Keel nodded. Potts stood up and said, "Your Honor, Mr. Keel wishes to withdraw his petition at this time." The room let out a breath it had been holding. Judge Tate looked at Catherine Birch. She handed him the guardianship petition for Dorothy Whitfield. He read it with the methodical attention of a man who had learned that moving carefully through documents was how you avoided problems you would have to fix later. He read the co-guardianship provision that listed Holt Decker. He looked out at the gallery, found Holt, and looked at him for a moment. Holt met his eyes and held them. Judge Tate looked back at the document. He said, "Guardianship is granted to Dorothy Whitfield with Holt Decker designated as co-guardian. The child will reside with her grandmother. The trust account is accepted into the record, and the terms are approved. We're adjourned." He brought down his gavel. Clara turned in her chair and looked at Holt. He nodded once. She turned and looked at Dorothy. Dorothy was already moving. Outside, the morning had warmed by a few degrees, and the light had shifted from gray to gold, the particular autumn gold that made the flat Indiana landscape look like something that had been painted by someone who loved it. The crowd in the parking lot had not moved. 2,000 people had waited through the hour and some of the proceeding in the cold and the quiet, and were still there when the courthouse doors opened. Holt came out first with Clara beside him. He stopped at the top of the steps. The crowd was facing the courthouse. Every face turned upward. The silence was the same silence as before, total and deliberate, the silence of people who have agreed without discussion that this moment does not need noise. Diesel was at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at Holt. Holt looked out at the crowd. He thought about saying something. He stood there for a moment and thought about it and realized there was nothing that needed to be said, that the saying of things would add nothing to what was already here, and that the people in this crowd understood that as well as he did. He walked down the steps with Clara beside him. At the bottom, Diesel raised one hand. 2,000 engines started. The sound came up all at once from everywhere, from the parking lot and the street and the fields beyond the town, a single vast wave of sound that rolled across Millhaven, the way weather rolls across flat land, filling everything, reverberating off the courthouse walls and the building fronts and the grain elevator at the edge of town. Clara clapped both hands over her ears. She laughed. It came out of her surprise, the laugh, the way joy sometimes comes when you have not been expecting it, and your body does not have time to manage it. A pure, unguarded sound that was almost lost in the engine roar, but that Holt was close enough to hear. He looked at her. She was standing with her hands over her ears, and her face turned up into the sound, and laughing, the small leather vest on her shoulders with the single word on the back, and her eyes were bright and open, and both of them were working. He put his hand on her shoulder. She reached up and put her hand over his. Dorothy and Clara met in the corridor outside the courtroom. Holt had stepped back to give them the space. He stood at the end of the corridor with Rex beside him, both of them watching. Dorothy went to her knees on the courthouse floor, which was a thing she did without apparent consideration of whether it was dignified or practical, went down on both knees in her good slacks on the linoleum, and opened her arms, and Clara walked into them. They held each other for a long time. Dorothy's eyes were closed and her arms were around Clara, and she was saying something very quietly that Holt was too far away to hear. Clara had her face against Dorothy's shoulder. The social worker was standing against the wall watching them. She had been crying since the parking lot and had stopped pretending she wasn't. Rex was looking at the corridor wall. After a while, Dorothy stood up, which took some effort from both knees, and took Clara's face in both hands and looked at her carefully and completely, the way you look at something you have been missing and want to verify is real. Clara looked back. Then Dorothy turned around and walked to where Holt was standing. She came to his chest. Her grip on both his hands was stronger than her size suggested. She looked up at him with the sharp, dark eyes that Clara was going to have in 50 years. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice was steady and low. "But you found my granddaughter and you kept her alive. You and that man over there." She glanced at Rex. "There is nothing I can say that's enough for that, so I won't try to find it." She held his hands for a moment. "Just come to breakfast on Sunday," she said. "Bring your friend." The bikers left over the next 2 days. They rode out in long lines down the county road and the highway beyond it, heading in every direction back to Ohio and Oregon and Tennessee and Texas and all the other places they had come from. Some of them stopped at the shop before they left. Some pulled over when they saw Holt outside and reached out a hand and shook his without saying anything and got back on their bikes and rode. Some just lifted a hand as they passed on the highway. By Wednesday evening, the field outside town was empty again, tire tracks in the cold dirt, the only evidence of what had been there. Rex was already at the bench the next morning when Holt arrived. The shop smelled the same. The tools were where they always were. That was Rex's answer to most things. On Thursday, he told Holt without preamble what he had done to the back room. Holt went and looked at it. The two cots, the small chest of drawers, the mounted shelf, the space heater, the cooler, the clean towel, the bar of soap still in its wrapper. He stood in the doorway for a while. Rex said, "I let it be known. Quiet, through the right people. Any kid in the county sleeping rough, they can come here." "How many know?" "Enough," Rex said. "The pastor at 5th Street, the woman who runs the food bank on Grant, the deputy, Dooley knows." Holt looked at the room, at the two cots side by side and the shelf on the wall and the lamp in the corner, casting its plain, reliable light. He looked at it for a long time. Then he nodded. 2 weeks later, the first one came. A boy of 13 brought to the shop door by the food bank woman at 9 in the evening with a backpack and no explanation offered or requested. Rex put him on the cot, fed him from the hot plate, and in the morning made calls until he had located an aunt in Terre Haute, who had not known where the boy was and drove 4 hours to come get him. After that, they came in irregular intervals. A sister and a brother, 7 and 9, who had been sleeping in their family's broken-down car for 2 weeks while their mother was hospitalized. A girl of 14 who reminded Rex of Clara strongly enough that he had to walk outside and stand in the cold for a few minutes before he could go back in and speak to her calmly. 3 more over the following months, each one different, each one the same in the essential way, needing the same fundamental things: warmth, food safety, someone who would make calls on their behalf without asking what they had done to end up where they were. The chapter sent money every month. They had agreed to it in the 2 days after the courthouse in a conversation between Diesel and the chapter presidents without Holt's knowledge or input. It came as a deposit to the shop account, a specific amount designated for what they called in the accounting Clara's room. Holt found out about it 3 months later and called Diesel about it. Diesel said, "It's not your money. It's the room's money. Let it be." Holt let it be. Clara found out about the room on a Sunday morning, nearly a year later, when she came to the shop with Dorothy for their weekly breakfast. By that point, the Sunday morning had become a fixed thing, as regular and certain as the tide Dorothy making eggs and biscuits in the kitchen of the rented house in the neighboring town, while Holt and Rex sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and occasionally contributed to a conversation that Dorothy mostly conducted on her own terms. On this particular Sunday, Clara wandered to the back of the shop while the adults were occupied and opened the door to the back room and stood there for a while looking at the cots and the shelf and the lamp. When she came back to the kitchen, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "How many kids have been in there?" Rex said 11 so far. She said, "Are they all okay?" Rex said, "Everyone." She was quiet again. She looked at the kitchen table and the adults around it, and then she looked at the room through the shop doorway, the two cots visible from where she stood, the shelf above the chest of drawers with a few things on it that belonged to whoever was staying there at the moment. She said, "Good," one word. Then she sat back down and picked up her fork. She turned 12 in December, and the first real winter Holt had paid attention to in 3 years. The cold coming in off the flat fields with nothing to slow it down, and the bare trees along the county road standing like dark marks against the pale sky. Dorothy made a cake. Rex came. Diesel drove down from Ohio and showed up at the door of the rented house in his road vest, holding a bag that contained a paperback about engines and a wool hat with the tag still on it, both selected with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who asked what a person needed rather than guessing what they wanted. Clara turned 13 that next winter, and 14 the one after each year, a little taller and a little more settled in herself, the drawn quality she'd had when Holt found her filling out slowly the way a drought-damaged field fills out after enough steady rain. Not all at once, but incrementally convincingly, until one day you look at it and realize it looks like what it was always supposed to look like. She did well in school, not effortlessly, but with the determined application of someone who understood that school was a tool and tools were meant to be used. She was methodical about it, the same way she was methodical about most things. The same seriousness she brought to folding napkins applied to solving for X and writing paragraphs about books she had actually read. She made friends, a small number of them chosen with the careful selectivity of someone who had learned that not everyone who appeared in your life was there to add to it. Dorothy kept her busy with the garden and the church choir and what Dorothy called practical knowledge, which covered cooking and basic carpentry and the reading of a bank statement, all delivered with the matter-of-fact directness of a woman who believed that competence was a form of safety, and safety was the point. Holt came on Sundays without fail, and on most weekday mornings as well, riding the 20 miles to the rented house in the early morning before the town woke up and leaving something on the front step. Sometimes a paper bag from the bakery he passed on the way, a biscuit and an egg-folded napkin inside the reverse of the original transaction, and understood by both of them to be exactly that. Sometimes just a cup of coffee in a sealed cup with her name on it, in his large, unpracticed handwriting. Sometimes she was already awake and saw him coming down the road from the kitchen window and ran out in her pajamas and bare feet across the cold porch, and he would catch her with one arm and carry her back inside, and Dorothy would make him sit down and have breakfast, whether he said he wanted it or not, which he did every time, though he never said so. Sometimes he came before she was up, and he just left the thing on the step and rode back through the early morning light, and that was enough too. He taught her about engines on Saturday afternoons in the shop, starting from the beginning, from the names of things and the purpose of things and the logic that connected them. She learned quickly and with the focused intensity of someone who found in mechanical systems the same satisfying clarity that some people find in mathematics, the way a thing either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, there is always a reason, and the reason can always be found. By the time she was 14, she could rebuild a carburetor faster than most of the men who brought their bikes to Rex's shop. Rex had clocked her once without telling her he was doing it, and had mentioned the result to Holt one afternoon without particular ceremony, the way Rex mentioned things that were true and worth noting. Holt had not said anything, but his face had done something that Rex, who had known that face for 40 years, recognized as pride in its purest and most uncomplicated form. He taught her to ride on a Saturday in early spring when the fields were just beginning to show the first faint green at their edges. Rex had spent the winter quietly rebuilding a small bike, a 250 cubic centimeter Honda, that had come in for parts and been gradually assembled into something reliable, kept under a tarp in the corner of the shop with no stated destination, until one Saturday it was moved to the empty parking lot across the road and the tarp came off. Clara stood in the parking lot and looked at the bike. Holt showed her the controls without rushing anything in sequence, the logic of each part before the next. Then he stepped back. She got on. She stalled it twice. On the third attempt, she got it moving and crossed the lot at a careful pace, found the feel of the throttle adjusted. On her fourth pass, she reached the far corner and leaned into it, not aggressively but correctly. Her body understanding the physics of it a half second before her mind caught up, and she came out of the turn smooth and straight and accelerating. She let out a sound, not a word, something that came from deeper than words, the sound a person makes when something that has been held tightly releases all at once, when a kind of joy that has no complicated content simply runs out through the body because there is nowhere else for it to go. Holt stood at the edge of the parking lot and heard it. He thought it might be the best sound he had heard in a very long time. The annual rally started the second year and became permanent by the third. October the same weekend every year. Riders came in from all over the country, not 2,000 now, but still hundreds camping in the field outside town that had become understood to be the place for it. Raising money for Clara's room, eating at Patsy's diner, in rotating shifts until Loretta and Bertie were exhausted and happy, and the register was fuller than in any other week of the year. Loretta cried every year at some point during the Saturday evening dinner. The long table in the back of the diner with Clara and Dorothy and Holt and Rex and Diesel and whoever had come with Diesel. She was not certain exactly why, only that something about the combination of these particular people in this particular place, when she let herself think about where it had all started and where it had arrived, produced in her an emotion that moved through her eyes, whether she invited it to or not. Bertie, for his part, made sure the kitchen was staffed properly for rally weekend from the second year on, and if he was moved by any of it, he expressed it in the quality of the food, which was always excellent on that particular Saturday night, better than usual in ways that were noticeable without being commented upon. The third year, on a quiet Sunday morning in October just before the rally weekend began, Holt walked into Patsy's alone. He took his usual booth, the corner one with a view of both the door and the window. Loretta brought him his coffee without being asked. Black, no sugar in the heavy ceramic mug with the worn pattern. He sat. He looked out the window at the street, the early morning empty street with the stoplight cycling through its colors, for nobody the same street it had always been and would continue to be. After he was done looking at it, patient and indifferent in the way that streets are patient, he thought about 3 years ago sitting in the same booth with the same coffee. The 3 years of empty mornings before the morning the paper bag appeared on his seat. He thought about what a morning had felt like in those years, the flatness of it, the way each one was identical to the one before, and he had not minded that because minding required wanting something different. He heard the bell over the door. He did not look up right away. He heard footsteps cross the diner floor. He heard Loretta say something quietly at the counter, a single word, her voice careful the way voices get when something matters. He heard the footsteps stop. Then something was set down on the table in front of him, a small brown paper bag. He looked up. Clara Mae Whitfield was 14 years old and stood in jeans and a flannel shirt with her hair in a braid and her hands at her sides, and she was looking at him with the steady, serious look she had carried since the first morning in the parking lot. That look that was both older than her age and exactly her age, that took things seriously because she had learned early that things were serious. She did not speak. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked back to the counter and sat down on a stool. Holt looked at the bag on the table. He sat with it for a moment. The diner was very quiet. Loretta was standing at the counter with her attention directed somewhere else, which was her way of giving a person room. He opened the bag. Inside a biscuit worm, a hard-boiled egg already peeled, a napkin folded in half and then in half again, the corners meeting exactly the same deliberate, careful folds that had been the first evidence of her. The first sign that behind the small shadow moving across the lot in the early dark was a person who believed the way you gave something mattered as much as the giving itself. He held the napkin. He looked across the diner at her. She was watching him from the counter stool. When he looked at her, she smiled a real smile, the full-face kind that he had watched come back over 3 years from the thin, cautious version she'd had when he first found her. And then she gave him a small, deliberate thumbs up that was entirely 14 years old and entirely her, and made something happen in his chest that was warm and steady and had no grief in it at all. He smiled back. He ate the biscuit. He ate the egg. He held the napkin and looked out the window at the street and thought about how things come around when you stay long enough to see them. How a single small act moves outward in directions it was never aimed and touches things it never knew were there. How an 11-year-old girl in a torn jacket who believed the way you folded a napkin was worth getting right had set in motion something that reached across 3 states and 2,000 people, and one woman getting on a plane in Knoxville, and one old man sitting on a floor in the dark learning that he was not finished after all. He thought about Nadine. He thought about her the way he could think about her now with the full love of it and without the full weight of it. The way grief becomes after enough time has passed and enough life has been lived inside it. The love outlasting the loss and being what remains. He thought she would have been glad about all of it. Not surprised because she had understood things about him that he was still learning, but glad. She would have sat across from Clara at a kitchen table somewhere and asked her real questions and listened to the real answers, and that would have been that. He finished his coffee. He set the folded napkin in his shirt pocket. He put a $5 bill under the coffee mug, stood, nodded to Loretta, and walked out. Clara waved at him from the counter stool. He waved back. He got on his bike. He started the engine. It turned over with the same sound it had always made, low and even, and settling into its rhythm the way it always had the sound that had started every morning of the last 11 years and would start the next one too. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the empty morning street and rode toward home through the October light coming gold across the flat fields. An old man in a leather vest with a folded napkin in his shirt pocket, and the road ahead of him, clear and straight, and the day beginning the way days begin when you have something to be here for. The stoplight at the corner turned green. He rode through it.